back, everyone, from your break. Next up, as you probably see on the screen, we've got John McLeod. Who is, I have it on good authority that he is the king of counselling. When I referred to some professionals about how I should introduce him, king of counselling was the #1 choice. But John, you're going to talk about something which I think is probably very close to your heart, and you feel needs to come into the conversations around counselling and into the therapy room, and I guess you're going to underline to us how that might happen, because it feels, I think, imperative to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that, that
was the intro, yeah.
Right, so I now start to talk. Yeah, is that right? Thank you.
No.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Kate, and it's been such a great day so far, and anyway, I'm going to talk about pluralistic therapy and climate change, and I'm planning to write a paper for the Pluralistic Practice website as soon as possible after this, so you can see the sources and have a record of this. So from that point of view, it's useful if you can make points or ask questions in the chat, so that that will help me to have an idea of what what to particularly focus on in a paper. And I don't think I'm going to be able to sort of scan the chat as we go along. So if John could keep an eye on that, because I'd definitely like to have time for a discussion and questions and so forth towards the end. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I was really wanting to anchor this in pluralistic practice. So I'm going to briefly talk about what I think is involved in pluralistic practice, and then look at the topic of climate change and how we can kind of approach that through our practice, and just some brief conclusions at the end. I think that sorry, I'm pausing now because the actual chat thing is, right. The chat box is on top of my text, but I should know what's in the text because I wrote it myself, so I'll press on. I really see pluralistic approach as kind of honouring and celebrating multiple perspectives and multiple ways of knowing. I think that we are at a point in history where there's a lot of kind of innovation and new ideas, and kind of older ideas don't kind of go away. So there's sort of a kind of layers and layers of kind of understanding of what mental health is and healing is and so forth within kind of European culture, but then there's ideas from other cultures coming in as well. So there's multiple perspectives. And I think, I mean, for me, when you start to look at it like that, it seems a bit odd to just be offering the client kind of one perspective, like psychoanalytic perspective or anything else, because there's sort of, the client probably has their own ideas which are quite different from that, possibly. I think also then, in terms of being in the room and putting these perspectives together, I think I see pluralistic practice as a kind of integration in the room and integration in the moment, and around finding ways of working together, and I particularly like Rolf Sundet's idea of putting difference to work. I think this has come up in a few talks already, that the client's got certain experiences and concepts and ideas of things that are going to help them, and the therapist does. And if you both thought exactly the same, well, you know, maybe that's okay. But if you've each got kind of different ideas, then you can, you're kind of bringing different things to the process. I also think that increasingly see therapy as a process of making, sort of making a difference, making new experiences and so forth, using whatever is available. That it's kind of, you know, referencing Art Bohart's work that talked about earlier, but also Mick's idea of directionality is that to be human is to have a sense of a future. So in the, you know, it's kind of easy for us to talk about goals. That's a kind of concept that's kind of widely used in therapy in recent years. But actually what we're referring to is having a sense of a future horizon. And the future horizon is particularly relevant in relation to climate change, because the future horizon is quite bleak. I think also that the kind of philosophy of pluralism kind of lends itself to a way of thinking that is and or both and rather than either or. So that if you're in a discussion with a client and that, you know, there's it emerges that it might be useful to look at negative thoughts and sort of critical ways of thinking, but also the person's childhood, it's not an either or, that it's usually possible to work with both of these things. And I think how it works in practice, and I think this is I think particularly relevant also at the moment for issues around climate change, is that I see it as a kind of punctuated therapy. The sessions are, there's some sort of discussion and negotiation about what are we going to work on, what tasks. There usually is more than one task you know, going on in the therapy. So you say what we're going to work on first today, and if what then will we turn to a bit later on in the session. And these the sort of topics within a session are punctuated by checking out feedback, meta-communication, and so forth. I think the pluralistic therapy calls upon us as therapists to be transparent, to be willing to share ideas, to kind of put on the table kind of what we're thinking. And I think it's an important to also view it as a fundamentally creative process, as that activates the capacity for the imagination and is also involves a focus on the everyday life of the person and the resources, or what you might call cultural resources within the person's everyday life. So there you have it, about a 2-minute summary of pluralistic therapy. By the way, I mean, I don't think there's so many people attending this event that that maybe some of you are not, you know, familiar with pluralistic therapy in detail, and there's lots of material on the website and the pluralisticpractice.com, and lots of suggestions for where to go for more information about different aspects of it. So one of the aspects of pluralistic therapy is this idea of pluralizing, of seeing things from different perspectives. And I wanted to kind of illustrate this in relation to climate change. When I was involved in running training courses and so forth, we used to have a lot of fun pluralizing concepts or issues such as anxiety or depression and things like that. And once you get a group of people sitting down thinking about, say, what is anxiety, how different ways of understanding anxiety, different meanings of anxiety, you end up with a sort of huge explosion of different ideas. So if you, this is kind of, I'm trying to give you a flavor of this here. I think I've never done one of these online conferences before, and you know, I can see from Susan's presentation that it's possible to have activities and exercises and things, but it didn't occur to me that I could do that. So I'm just sort of offering you a kind of summary pluralizing of climate change. And I think that one of the, when you start to kind of walk around the concept of climate change, I think I would say that climate change is a kind of shorthand term that is kind of the current way of thinking about what I would call the mess, the kind of mess that the human race has made of the world, and all sorts of different pollution, industrial pollution, plastic in the sea, plastic in birds and fishes, species loss, soil deterioration, and the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, the coronavirus pandemic has come from the intrusion of the human race into animal territories and so on, and this virus that, you know, wasn't harmful to whatever animal it came from has managed to clamber over into the human race. And I think that all of that is actually part of an unsustainable lifestyle. And I think that it's a lifestyle that's based on a kind of false understanding of the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And it's a relationship that is largely characterized by a sort of domination of the natural world and a kind of separation of human beings, like the environment is out there and we're somehow separate from that. And I think this is not really a good way of looking at things, that the climate change is in us, and it's part of all of us, and all these other things like the mess are in us. But I mean, this has deep historical roots, which we don't have time to go into now. And the fact that it's kind of kicked off big time in the last 30 years doesn't mean that it's just we can sort of put the clock back to 1970 or something like that, and it'll all be okay. There's something more kind of fundamental, I think. And I think also that it's associated with a really deep emotional pain, and which is largely submerged. I'll come back to that later. It's like a sort of sense of what have we done to the world? What have we done to ourselves? And then moving forward, it is pretty urgent for us to do something about this, and it requires action at all levels, from each of us as individuals through to states and nations and the United Nations and so forth. And that it requires action that builds on old ways of knowing, that somewhere in the past, in kind of indigenous cultures, Aboriginal cultures, First Nation cultures, American Indian cultures, and so on, there was a sort of knowledge about how to live in nature and with nature that we have kind of largely lost. And I think that the the kind of metaphors that I think are used by kind of people who are concerned about this are kind of to do with repairing, restoring, rewilding, finding something that is from a kind of lost way of knowing and living and so forth. And I think that one of the sort of key aspects of this pluralizing of climate change is that it's, on the one hand, it's awful, right? On the one hand, like say for me, I think ahead about my grandchildren, what sort of a world have they been kind of inherited from me and from all of us. And the very kind of frightening and awful things. But I think also there's this other side of it, which will come out in the talk, I think, a bit, which is the possibility of doing something different. And I think that's been around for a lot of people during the last 3 or 4 months with the pandemic of, oh, yeah, this is what the world looks like if we don't drive around all the time and if we slow down and so forth. So there's a lot that can be done and we need to get on with it. I think that there's been quite a lot of discussion of kind of equality and social justice and so on in the conference so far. And I think climate change is a kind of really crucial social justice issue. If we don't kind of get to grips with this, there's going to be precious little social justice for people in the future because we've kind of used all the resources, or like my generation has used all the resources. But I would also say that as right now and in the recent past, the people who are suffering most from climate change and all these other things are, poorer people, underprivileged people in other countries, in Africa and India and so forth. And that our, as I look outside my window, like Dundee, where I live, is kind of okay. Right, that's great, isn't it? But actually that's at the expense of many other places not being okay. So if we could sort of move on, like pluralistic therapy, and then what climate change is about, then what are the implications for practice? And the kind of version of a pluralistic model of therapy that Mick Cooper and I have developed and sort of trained people in is it kind of emphasizes the idea that a client has a sense of a future and has some sort of goals, not necessarily easy for the person to describe and identify the goals, but somewhere there will be something that they want to achieve through therapy. And that usually these goals you can only move towards achieving a goal by breaking it down into tasks. Now, my sense is that at the moment, very few clients are coming in and mentioning anything at all to do with climate change, climate change anxiety, sense of loss, whatever, as a goal of therapy. And, if some of you are finding different things with your clients, then I'd like to learn about that. But there was a study in collected data in USA in 2015, and did a survey of a lot of therapists around New York and found that that clients didn't bring in climate and environmental issues as their kind of main focus for therapy, but around half of them mentioned it in passing. And the therapist said sometimes they were able to kind of follow up on that and so forth, and sometimes they weren't. But if you think about an example of a client mentions something in passing, so a client might say, "Oh, I'm just back from holiday in Mexico. Holiday was great, but I felt really guilty about, going on such a long flight and the pollution from the flight adding to global warming and so on." So that can be seen as a kind of opening or an introduction of a possible topic for further exploration. And I think that the kind of skill set and approach of pluralistic therapy sort of lends itself to checking out, yeah, well, would you be interested in talking a bit more about that, or not? Yeah. So it's about being an active therapist and saying, well, I'm kind of hearing this. How important is this? Is it something you'd want to talk about? Now, I think so the client may then want to talk about it. And I think just the actual experience of talking about it may be quite helpful for people, because if you look at the research into people who are aware of climate change and environmental issues and so on, what a lot of people say is it's very hard to talk to anybody else about it, that they start to share their concerns and so on, and other people just sort of clam up. They don't want to hear about it and things like that, particularly if they're kind of deniers and so forth. So I think that there's one of the important processes in any type of therapy is the client being able to use the therapy session to, in a sense, practice talking about something that they can then talk about in the outside world. But this, this imaginary client talking about their, going to Mexico and a jet flight and things like that. It may once they've kind of begun to explore it, it may emerge as a goal of therapy. They may realize in the conversation that this is actually something that I really want to use at least some of the time in therapy to really look at, to how to stand up for my ecological principles and so forth. Because I realize I'm kind of making myself unhappy by kind of hiding that part of myself. Or it could be a task, it could be part of someone else. So the example there would be, my big goal in therapy is to kind of get into a better relationship with my children, particularly my son. And he's really interested in climate change. And if I can talk about this more, it'd be a good way of connecting with them. So that's kind of an example of kind of a pluralistic focus on goals and tasks, and a pluralistic willingness to check things out with clients and how that might pick up on something that's mentioned in passing type of incident. By the way, I think that if you are in a situation where you're recording sessions and listening to them and transcribing them, you tend to find a lot of things which I would call openings that you miss at the time. Right? Generally, as therapists, we have our own kind of inner checklist of things we're listening for, and actually that leads us to miss quite a lot of important things that clients talk about. Another thing in pluralistic therapy is the idea of having a shared understanding. And there's, which is being open about your assumptions about things. And yeah, we maybe see things differently, and how can we find a common ground between us, and maybe using case formulation, diagrams and things like this to facilitate that. But that sort of shared understanding there's lots of bits to it, but the basic bits of a shared understanding is an understanding of how the person's problem developed, and then how we might work to make a difference, what might be done to address the problem and move on. So I think that what I'm calling ecological theory, for want of a better term, ecological concepts and research, can be part of the shared understanding. So if you take a client who comes in and says, I'm depressed, I don't have any energy, no meaning in life, I feel I'm a failure, and so on. So any therapy theory that you have, that you know about, psychodynamic, CBT, humanistic, whatever, gives you a way of understanding that you can kind of offer the client and so on. But actually, ideas from ecology or the kind of relationship between human beings and nature, the natural world, are also relevant there. And I think the key idea in this is the kind of importance of kind of being in touch with nature and kind of having experience of nature within your life. So it's possible to say to the client, we've kind of looked at your depression in terms of this and that and other ways of thinking about it, and your own theory is whatever it happens to be. But another way of looking at your depression is that it may be that some aspects of it are that you are you're out of touch with nature. It's like you go to work and work in an office and you're hardly ever outdoors and things like that. And I think there's a lot of evidence that actually that has a kind of depressing effect on people's energy and so forth. And then, the other side of that, of positive things that the person might be able to do, being more energized and gaining more meaning in life through outdoor situations and spending time outdoors. And I think this can often be can be usefully linked to the client's life story. So that if they've talked about earlier periods in their life where they were kind of happier and they were kind of doing more things outdoor and in nature and so forth, and they've become a kind of wage slave who doesn't do anything, you can say, well, look, you've kind of, there's been periods in your life where you're able to do these things, and now you've kind of lost that, and it might be useful to rediscover it. There's then a kind of endless number of activities that can be that have been developed by therapists who are who believe in the importance of contact with nature and so forth. And probably the most straightforward for many of us is what's called walk and talk therapy. So this is what I would call kind of ordinary therapy, therapy where you're talking about client's issues, you're having a discussion, a conversation about whatever the client wants to talk about. But taking it out of doors. So you're kind of walking along and it kind of introduces a different rhythm to it, and different things are kind of triggered by the experience of being outdoors and so forth. And I think a lot of therapists have found it relatively straightforward to kind of add that into their repertoire. And I mean, if you're a pluralistic therapist, you're not necessarily, it's not that you're insisting the client does that, you're kind of offering it as a possibility that they might be interested in. I think that another thing that's relatively straightforward is to is to bring nature into the therapy room, to have objects and images and so on in the therapy room that may be reminders of mountains and beaches and parkland and animals and so forth, or that the client might bring in. So they might bring in kind of a diary they've kept about their involvement in nature, or they might bring in an object that they found and things like that. And exploring meaning of nature at different points in the person's life. I think then there's lots of kind of other activities or exercises and so on. I think something that can be a really powerful thing is a kind of version of the solution-focused miracle question. If you kind of imagine your life or the city that you live in at some point in the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, climate change is being seriously addressed, and taken seriously and so forth, what would it be like? And I think for a lot of people, that kind of liberation of the imagination to kind of have a sort of sense of where we might be if we did something different is a really joyful thing, and so forth. Lots of art-based activities, writing a letter to the earth, and so on. I think once you get out of, you're doing therapy outdoors, the natural world offers a kind of immense range of metaphors to do with growth, death, time, and so on, because it's all kind of happening in terms of plants growing or dying, and it's getting darker or getting lighter and so forth. So anyways, lots and lots of different things which are either that you can do with the client, the kind of therapy activities in the therapy room or walking along the road as a therapist and client, or there can be cultural resources. I mean, they're happening somewhere else, and the client's sort of tapping in to, meeting with other people with similar values and interests, and sort of having some of these experiences through such means. Something that's really interested me in all this is the what is actually involved in kind of what's kind of almost like the structure of a different relationship with nature. And I found very useful the work of Peter Kahn, who's at the University of Washington in Seattle, and his colleagues. And I guess what I'm coming from here is if you work with a client out of doors, I mean, if you get to the point where they really want to explore this sort of fundamental relationship with nature and so on, and you're outdoors, there can be a lot of things happening outdoors, and as a therapist, it's kind of hard to know what might be helpful or what might not be helpful. So what Kahn and colleagues have been trying to do is to develop a sort of language for talking about human nature interaction. It's almost like, what are the core categories or the core descriptors of what is involved in sort of being with nature, being in nature. So these are very kind of ordinary things in a way: lying on the ground in nature, building a shelter in nature, being alone in nature, cooking food over a fire outdoors, encountering a nature that can hurt us by falling or some animal biting us or something like that. And one of the recent studies on this, the Can, Weiss and Harrington 2018 study that's there, they went into a nursery school, a kind of one of these outdoor nursery schools where the children spend pretty well all the time. You know, preschool children spend pretty well all the time outdoors. And they just looked, they said, well, what are the kind of patterns or categories of the children interacting with nature, you know, like, you know, human beings before they become socialized out of nature like the rest of us. So if we take lying on the ground in nature, so this is one of the categories that kind of crystallized in the nursery school study. Here's a couple of pictures of children who, I must admit, remind me of my granddaughter, who's about that age, and the kind of thing that she would do. It's just sort of being there and lying down and kind of having a sense of being part of the earth, I guess, and so forth. Another one is building a shelter in nature. So this is a picture of a little boy in that nursery school who has been gathering these branches and things like that and made himself a little home, a little house to sit in. So these seem to be kind of fundamental categories. And I mean, they're at an early stage of developing this, and for reasons that I won't go into now, they think that there's probably 100 or 200 of these sort of categories that they're eventually going to find. But so I've just given you a taste of some of them. Yeah, the point I'm making is they're keen for other people to chip in and make suggestions to them in this project. I'd like now to talk about something a bit different, so I've kind of said a little bit about what might happen actually in the therapy room, the kind of conversations you might have with a client. But I think there's another aspect of it, which I think is also part of pluralistic practice, which is positioning your practice, kind of designing your practice to meet the needs of clients or to meet the needs of a community and so on. And I think that therapy has always positioned itself in relation to social change. So if you think about psychoanalysis, I mean, I know this is a gross oversimplification, but at the time when Freud was living, European society was generally coming out of a kind of hundreds of years of kind of a rather kind of religious way of life in which you kind of did what you were told. There was a strict hierarchy, so into a more industrialized, science-informed, secularized way of life where people were more kind of autonomous individuals and not kind of bound to families in the same way. And so, oh wow, psychoanalysis is a good way of thinking about that. And then, you know, after the Second World War, you've got this explosion of prosperity and travel on jet planes and freedom and sexual freedom and things. And then you get the humanistic therapies and so on. So it's one of these things that has never really particularly discussed within the therapy world, I don't think, but I think is there if you take a historical perspective. But these shifts have tended to occur quite slowly, and the kind of repositioning of therapy practice in response to climate change needs to happen more quickly. And I think it's encouraging that if you take the coronavirus crisis as a kind of not little, but as a well, little in the sense of it's not as bad as things are probably going to get. But anyway, you know, the therapy community has responded very actively to coronavirus and the kind of mental health issues and working online and things like that. But I think the others, so maybe we're able to do that. Maybe we're able to all kind of get up to speed on working with climate change and the environmental mess and things like that. But I think there's another aspect of it which is different from the previous repositionings of therapy, which is, I think, kind of, for the most part, all the previous repositionings of therapy up to now have been in the direction of individualism, right? In the direction of the kind of autonomous, bounded self of an individual. Whereas to respond to the coronavirus pandemic and to respond to climate change, we need a collectivist response, right? The coronavirus crisis has kind of made that absolutely clear. It's like we all need to keep a social distance. We all need to wear masks and things like that. And it's clearly hard for some people to do that. So I was wanting to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which practices could be redesigned in relation to the climate change and this other stuff that I've been talking about. And I think that one of the places that's actually quite important is the information that the client gets before they see you. The information that's on your website, or if you have old-fashioned things like paper leaflets, or if you're working in an agency or an organization, you've got a waiting list, you might have like a bit of the website, like resources while you're waiting and things like that. And I don't know if anybody's looked at this, but my guess at the moment is that nobody is including much at all in that kind of pre-therapy information around, climate change might be an issue you might want to talk about, or outdoor activities might be something that would help you with your depression while you're waiting to see a therapist and things like that. And I'm interested in the kind of the effects of that kind of pre-therapy information, because in psychology and like experimental psychology, and there's been a couple of studies of therapy and so on, there's something called priming, like information that is given to people that kind of predisposes them to then think about things and primes them to think about particular issues and so forth. And then there's I think something that a lot of pluralistic therapists do is they have psychoeducational materials, they have stuff for clients to read. I've heard examples of that from Mason's talk this morning and Cat Stevens' talk. And so does the information that you offer clients include anything at all about the natural world and so forth? Then I think is the collaboration with people from other disciplines. So there's, and this I think is links with what Andrew Reeves was saying in the first talk in the conference, that as therapists, perhaps most of us are kind of okay about kind of walking up a hill with a client or along a beach and things and having a conversation. But if it comes to more kind of outdoor pursuits things, kayaking, wilderness expeditions and things, you need kind of experts who can help the client to feel safe and so on. So that these sort of activities require some sort of collaboration between a client, between a therapist and other organizations. I mean, community gardens are a really good example. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that community gardens are helpful for people's mental health and things like that. And, there's people who develop community gardens, and maybe as counsellors we can have conversations with them about working together. I think another kind of really kind of important development around all this is equine therapy, is horses. I mean, I think horses and dogs are pretty therapeutic. I'm slightly anti-cat, but dogs are all over the place. But it's kind of to get access to horses and to use horses in a therapeutic way is more of a kind of structured thing. And then there's kind of other people who are working with kind of nature in terms of spiritual activities like Buddhist retreats that are in kind of outdoor, remote areas, and shamanistic rituals that draw upon ancient traditions from First Nations and so on and so forth. So I think there's really important things that can happen in terms of linking up with colleagues from other disciplines. And then I think another way of positioning our practice is to think about particular client groups. And earlier I said, well, maybe half of clients might mention something in passing about climate change, etc. But there's kind of subgroups of clients who are very directly affected. And these would be people who are exposed to specific climate events, like people in rural areas in Australia whose whole lives have been destroyed by the fires, the people in northern Canadian communities whose whole lifestyle is built around the sea freezing and being able to travel from one place to another in winter over the frozen sea, and the sea doesn't freeze anymore and things like that. So I think there's two things about this. One is that there's increasingly more people are going to be exposed to specific climate events. So we're going to meet more of such clients who have really had to face this. But I think that the therapists and psychologists and mental health workers who have worked in these communities with people directly affected by specific climate events have written about it and done research on it, and have got things that we can all learn from. I think refugees are many refugees are people who are fleeing warfare in particular countries, but if you just look a bit closer, what's the warfare come from? Because the water's dried up, or it's got too hot to grow crops and things like that, and then there's been conflict, and then people have become refugees. And then there's frontline workers, and I think the two category of frontline workers that are perhaps particularly sort of salient are climate change scientists, who I think are under tremendous pressure, because climate change scientists are generally have to kind of keep their mouths shut and behave themselves, because anything off message that they say will be picked up by the right-wing press. And they've got they're the holders of this awful knowledge of what's going to happen to the human race. And then there's activists, people who work in Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion and things like that, and many other organizations. And activists have a life of failure, don't they? I mean, you become dispirited because nothing ever changes and things. And I don't know whether it's possible to kind of reach out as therapists and say, well, I'm willing to come in and consult with your organization to offer a counseling service for your organization, things like that, if you're particularly committed to this. I think a further group of clients is people who we haven't seen yet, but we may see quite soon, people under pressure to change their behavior or lifestyle. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, for example, when smoking was normal, and and the idea that there would be kind of psychologists and therapists offering smoking cessation clinics and so forth would have been a bizarre notion. So, but this has happened, hasn't it? Other areas like people drinking and driving, or even domestic violence and sexual violence, a lot of that was kind of fairly normalized, and now you've got special therapeutic interventions for perpetrators of these things. And I don't know, will we see kind of support lines and interventions for people who refuse to wear masks and things, or will different communities start putting pressure on people who don't recycle their garbage and so on and so forth? Probably, I think we will. So just to wind up with a couple of things. I think all of this depends very much on looking at yourself. And I think that one of the big themes in pluralistic practice is the therapist being open about what they can offer, what their understanding is, and kind of being, thinking about what they might offer to different clients and rehearsing it and practicing it and using deliberate practice to do that. So all that's part of pluralistic therapy anyway. But I think that working with climate change issues and the other kind of linked issues that I've been talking about are also, the fact is that the issue is not just the client's issue, is it? It's also your issue. We're all in this together, and so on. And in my own personal development, I mean, some of the themes that have been around for me have been the kind of the kind of connecting with or being aware of my emotional reaction to what is happening. So I can remember in my own life, there used to be lots of insects, there used to be birds, lots more birds, so that I can read in the newspapers and books and so on that there's been a lot of species loss and so on and such like. But within my own life, I know that there's been a complete devastation of wildlife. How do I feel about that? I don't have any, it's hard to feel about that. And I think that some of the literature on climate change, environmental change, and the crisis is about that we don't have a language for that kind of loss. We don't have rituals for that kind of loss. We've got language and rituals for losing people we love, but not for species and things like that. And I don't have time to go through all of these. I think another thing that I personally have found really difficult is lifestyle change. And it's so that once I started to really think about these things, I thought that every day, virtually everything I do contributes to environmental destruction, from buying food from Tesco's all wrapped up in plastic to looking at the clothes I wear and think, well, once I stop wearing these clothes, what happens to them? Will they kind of be biodegradable and things? And probably not, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of huge challenges for all of us. And I think that just the other thing I'd like to mention is timescales. That one of the big differences between our culture and the kind of cultures that mainly preceded us in the world, were that these other traditional cultures had much longer timescales, that they kind of consulted their ancestors and they spoke to future generations, and they had a way of life that was kind of had that huge kind of time horizon, whereas we have such a narrow time horizon. The paper by Laszlo and Davis is, I think, a really useful resource in terms of starting to think about your own development and the questions you could ask yourself. The another thing is, just very briefly, is professional support and leadership. And I mean, Andrew talked a lot very passionately this morning about how inward looking the therapy community in Britain tends to be. Really, we need to be doing our bit more. We need to be taking a stand. I would want us to have an ethics of kind of respect for the planet and so on within our ethical codes, and kind of set a good example and things like that, and collaborate with other disciplines, and do more research and training that's relevant to this. So I completely lost track of the time. I think hopefully we've got some time for discussion and questions. I think just my conclusions are, I don't know, maybe very simple, that these are really big issues, they're important issues and urgent issues. And it's just a matter of all of us doing what we can. So that's not just kind of turning up for Extinction Rebellion demos or Greenpeace and such like and so forth, but doing what we can within our professional roles and using our sort of professional skills to make a difference. And I think the pluralistic approach offers a framework that is flexible enough and collaborative enough and dialogical enough to do this, and to also work with people from other groups and organizations. So, questions?
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm not noticing any direct questions, so maybe there might be a couple just come in. You did get some feedback about speciesism around the cat being anti-cat. I think there's a lot of cat owners, so that was fun in the chat room.
I think that was a kind of Scottish joke, actually.
I get that real droll Scottish humour, John. Very, very fun. Some colleagues saying that they are seeing more clients starting to bring these kind of issues into therapy. So that was really interesting and resonates.
Can I just say, I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at. Yeah. And within the, I don't know, I can't remember what it's called. There's a kind of pluralistic therapy steering group and the subgroups and so on. There's a group of us talking about research and beginning to kind of work on what's on the website to kind of encourage more research. And I actually think some research where people just shared their experience of how many clients are talking about climate issues and similar issues, and how big a part of the therapy is it, and how are they working with, just to kind of share our professional knowledge and professional experience. I think that would be such an interesting piece of research at this point.
Yeah, it'd be great to catch that in the research.
Yeah.
John, we've used up all our time, but there's just so many colleagues saying thank you in the chat room. Just really, really appreciating you bringing these issues and to us and thinking about like where we have some agency and power as practitioners, and this and as people as well. So thank you so much, John. It's been just great. Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, so Kate has gone momentarily. So just wanted to say thank you so much for a fascinating session, John. So many comments and so much on Twitter. And we're going to have a quick break, and then when we come back, we will be having a panel discussion, which I am greatly looking forward to. So yeah, so just to say thank you very much, and see you all in 15 minutes.